All right, ladies and gentlemen, happy Tuesday. I appreciate you making sure that you behave for Mr. Khan today, who I believe is your sub. But nonetheless, I wanted to provide you guys a quick lesson for today with a little bit of classwork that you may have seen pop up there in eBackpack, and in addition, the opportunity for you guys to start thinking about your homework, which is the final homework assignment that I'll have due on Thursday, which ultimately is going to be about the amendments. That's something that we will start covering here in class beginning tomorrow. So actually, I'll have that homework assignment due on Friday, since I haven't posted it yet in eBackpack. Just kind of picking up from where we left off yesterday, this particular slide shows you the presidential line of succession. We looked at a handful of these figures yesterday as far as who is a familiar name and face in today's news, as far as the Speaker of the House, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Defense, and Attorney General. While you will not need to know the line of succession for your quiz or your test, I just provide this because I always get extreme questions in regards to what happens if something happens to the president or the vice president. I would say that the worksheet that we did work on yesterday in class is something as far as Chapter 7 goes. If I were to put a people matching column on your next test, that would be where I would get those people from, as far as who is the current president, vice president, Speaker of the House, etc. So I'll talk a little bit more about that on Friday when we start to review. Okay, and if you have any additional questions on that, obviously tomorrow would be the day to ask. All right, Section 3 of the Constitution, as far as Article 2, Section 3, talks about presidential responsibilities in regards to the president having to do things as president, not necessarily a power, but things that he has to do when president. And first and foremost is this idea that he needs to address Congress in what is known in the Constitution as a State of the Union. State of the Union addresses, as we saw a few weeks ago, are an opportunity for the president to discuss the current state of the country, but also talk about what can the country do moving forward, plans for the country. How might they look to spend money? How might they look to build up the military? How might they look to cut taxes, or in some unfortunate cases, establish taxes? So by law, the president has to address Congress in a State of the Union at least once a year. And traditionally that has come, as we see it now, almost at the beginning of every year, calendar year that is, the president will have the opportunity to address Congress, and as we see it televised today, address the country. The president is also, as far as a responsibility standpoint goes, is that idea of checks and balances, the three-branch system of government, and due to that fact, the president is considered to be the chief legislator. Okay, so while we call the president the commander-in-chief of our armed forces, the president is also considered to be our chief legislator. While Congress can make laws, it is the president's responsibility to execute and enforce those laws that a Congress were to pass. Okay, so remember, we talked about how a bill becomes a law. It goes through both houses of Congress. It goes to the president's desk. If he decides to sign it into law, it's his job to enforce that law that is being passed by both houses of Congress. On the same token, as the chief legislator, it is his responsibility, if the law he does not see to be fit, it's his job to veto or reject the law. So these are all things that we had already spoken about in regards to how a bill becomes a law, the power that is given to a president. We see that here, his opportunity to use veto power. So again, kind of coming to define the executive branch here. Section 4, although not listed here in the notes, Section 4 is basically in regards to reiterating the idea of impeachment. Okay, we see impeachment come up in the Senate, we talk about it in the House, and now we have it here in the fact that a president can be removed from office. Section 4, as it says there in your iBook, president can be removed because of treason, bribery, and other high crimes or misdemeanors. So high crimes, grand larceny, stealing, etc., things of that nature. So a president, as it says in the Constitution, can be removed from office if there is substantial evidence for that. When you think about it, that's it. Okay, Article 2 is only 4 sections. Section 1 spends a lot of time explaining the Electoral College. Okay, we see Section 2, powers given to the president. Section 3 talks about responsibility. Section 4 says the president could be impeached. Okay, and again, that why is that put in there? I think it has to do a little bit with the concern of past experiences and what the president may represent to the country in 1787, 1788 as this one central leader. But that's it. Okay, when you think about Article 1, when we talked about the legislative branch, that was 10 sections long. Okay, so to give you an idea as far as the significance of the foresight of our founding fathers, a lot of thought and attention went to the legislative branch. The executive branch, it's detailed, but certainly not to the extent that we saw that detail in Article 1 with the legislative branch. All right, now finally for Article 3, which as we mentioned in the last chapter at the convention was probably of the 3 branches the least debated, is finally the judicial branch. All right, everyone was in a lockstep agreement at the Constitutional Convention that at a federal level we did need some semblance of a federal court system, which is why the Supreme Court was created. Article 3, Section 1, and really Sections 2 and 3 are giving us a blueprint for a very vague picture as to what the Supreme Court is going to be. If you were to look at your iBook, Article 3, Sections 1, 2, and 3, a lot of the information on this slide isn't even in the Constitution. It's just something that kind of evolved, and that's something that our founding fathers wanted, with a federal court system that, again, for the most part, is not going to be elected by the people. They are a separate entity. They're almost they're working with the executive and legislative branches, but they're almost independent in the fact that those 2 branches have elected officials, whereas the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, would have appointed officials. Okay, as we know, as we mentioned, a power of the president is to appoint Supreme Court justices. We've seen President Trump appoint 2 in his 2.5 years in office, which is certainly not the norm. Okay, President Obama and President Bush, 2 previous presidents, appointed 2 in the span of 8 years during their 8 years in office. So President Trump, the fact that he has been able to put 2 justices on the Supreme Court in 2.5 years is not all that common. Although appointed by a president, we do need an approval by the Senate for anyone who is appointed. Okay, the way that the Supreme Court was established was that you would need a 2/3 majority vote in the Senate for Senate approval. Now, we've seen since 2013 an option on the table known as the nuclear option, where if the Senate decides to vote on making the vote nuclear, it means essentially that you just need a simple majority. So we saw that play out in the previous 2 Supreme Court justice appointments, in the fact of Neil Gorsuch was elected at a vote of 51-50. There was a tie, so Vice President Pence had to cast a vote, and Justice Kavanaugh as well, which I believe he wound up receiving just over the allotted number or needed to become Supreme Court Justice. One of the things that is important, at least for me, in discussing the Supreme Court is 2 things. The first of which is the notion that a Supreme Court Justice is elected for life. Unless they retire due to health concerns or personal reasons, or they die, they are appointed for life. And the reason for that is, again, it goes back to that idea of being a private, almost an independent entity within the federal government. They are not bound to re-election. They don't need to try to publicize themselves to be re-elected. When they're appointed, they serve. They serve the Constitution. They serve the American people. So that is why John Roberts, pictured there seated in the middle, is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He is only the 17th Chief Justice, whereas we've had only 45 presidents. There's only been 17 Chief Justices in the Supreme Court. So we have justices that serve, 15, 20, 30 plus years. Okay, so we don't see a tremendous amount of turnover there. And although they're not elected, although they serve for life, there's also not an age requirement. And while that comes up sometimes as far as in the House and the Senate and the office of the president, the Supreme Court, there is technically by law no age limit. So for anyone involved in the Supreme Court, why is that the case? Well, our founding fathers figured that if someone was going to serve at the request of the president and approved by the Senate, that there has to be merit to that appointment. Okay, they're not being elected based off of popularity. They're being appointed by their experience. If I went to a job interview, I might get the job because of if I'm qualified, or maybe at times overqualified. If I wanted to be a doctor and I walked into an interview at Winthrop Hospital and they asked me what my experience is in my med school, and I said, well, I taught at Kellenberg for 11 years, I want to be a brain surgeon, I'm not going to get the job. The same could be said with the Supreme Court. Okay, the Supreme Court justices are the doctors of the Constitution. They are the so-called experts. Okay, and they're going to be put in that position knowing that there's only so many, knowing that they are appointed based off of their experience. We have yet to have a president appoint someone who wasn't a judge or someone who wasn't a lawyer, okay, with a tremendous amount of background. Someone asked me a question earlier this week. The youngest Supreme Court justice ever to be appointed was 32. Okay, that was done during James Madison's presidency. So just something important. Last thing I have here, okay, Section 1. The job of the judicial branch is to interpret the law. Their job is not to make the laws. Congress makes the laws. If there is a decision made and upheld in the Supreme Court, Congress can wish to make a law based off of that Supreme Court decision, but it is not the judicial branch's job to make laws. That was very important in 1787. We will see how that kind of plays out in Chapter 9 when we get to judicial review and what that means and how it kind of changed the fate of the Supreme Court. But for now, in 1787, the idea was that they were to just simply interpret the law. Okay, Article 3, Section 2, very briefly, basically talks about where the federal courts come into play, where the Supreme Court comes into play. The biggest thing for the Supreme Court is the fact that they are going to deal with cases involving the Constitution, laws, and treaties. So anything that is passed, kind of coming across the Supreme Court desk, hey, a law that's passed by Congress, approved by the president, is that constitutional? All right. If a constitutional right is violated, a lot of times the Supreme Court will hear it. So there's some cases that make their way to the Supreme Court. Not all cases do. All right. If I break the law by breaking the speed limit and I want to appeal my speeding ticket, I do not call President Trump and say I want my case to be heard in front of the Supreme Court. There's things that happen at the state level, but also that cross over to the federal level, and this would be a list of those. Cases involving ambassadors, those serving overseas, cases between two or more states. All right, we'll talk about examples later on in the year. If there is a slave who is living on a plantation in South Carolina, escapes, winds up in New York, a state that abolishes slavery, is that slave a free person now? Or are they still someone's property? That is something that the Supreme Court and the federal courts are going to have to decide. Okay, cases between citizens of different states. Okay, if I were involved in an altercation with living in New York with someone that lives in California, the case wouldn't be heard in New York. It wouldn't be heard in California. It's going to be heard in what we would consider to be a neutral site, which would be then a federal court. Okay, does that mean the Supreme Court? No. The Supreme Court has branches under that, and maybe when I get in tomorrow as part of our classwork, I'll kind of go over the structure of the federal court system. I've been drawing it on the board today, so kind of difficult for me to do I will be drawing it on the board tomorrow, since I'm making this the day before. But nonetheless, all right. Last but not least, set up trial by jury in all criminal cases except impeachment. What does that mean? All right. Remember, the Senate serves as the jury for any sort of impeachment. As you can kind of get a gist from what you've just filled out in your notes, I'm not asking you to write out a lot because I'm not really asking you to know a lot about Section 2. All right. Section 3 is the final section. It talks about treason being the highest crime in the federal court system. All right. And then that's it. Okay. So Article 3 is only 3 sections. It's very loosely defined as far as the branch, and it is a branch that through the years with experience will further develop. All right. So, for example, it doesn't say that there is a mandated 9 chief Supreme Court justices needed. That's something that's done throughout the course of history. In 1789, the Judiciary Act of 1789 is passed, something we'll go over in Chapter 9. It established only 6 justices. All right, so now we have 9. Was there an amendment made that changed that? No, because it was never in the Constitution. All right. All right, last but not least, Article 4 is to discuss the relationship between the federal government and the states. For obviously, there is a huge loss at the for the supporters of the Articles of Confederation, in which state power was taken away and federal power was given to the federal government. And because of that, I think that's why our founding fathers wanted this to be Article 4. We talk about the 3 branches of government. Each is kind of, the legislative is remade, the executive and judicial is made, and now, well, what do we do with the states? It goes to emphasize what we already spoke about in the what does the Constitution create? It creates a federation. All right, federalism. We have a country that is consisting of 2 governments working together, okay, at the federal and the state level with power given to the federal government. Article 4 also talks about the responsibilities the states have to each other, all right, recognizing that we are the United States, not the independent states of America, but it also lists the responsibility the federal government has to the individual states, all right? So if you wanted to look at your Constitution, you can see as to where some things are described. It goes into a little bit of detail, but not all that much. And last but not least, it provides for admission of new states and the changing of state boundaries. So if New York decided essentially that they were sick of Long Island, New York can't make Long Island the 51st state. It has to be done at the federal level. Okay, boundaries that are established by the states are protected at the federal level by the federal government. So our boundaries with New Jersey or Connecticut, or even Vermont for that matter, are all to be established at the state level. So again, Section 4 is not all that complicated, or I should say Article 4. It is broken into 4 sections, but we're not going to get into the specifics of that. Okay, tomorrow we're going to talk about the amendment process, the supremacy clause, and the ratification process after our quiz. Okay, and that will leave us Friday to take a look at the amendments, the way this will all break down, since Thursday you have your STEM day. So here's what I need from you now. Tomorrow, your quiz is on everything up to this slide. All right, so if you have any questions, feel free to see me today after school or tomorrow morning. It goes from Article 1, Section 8, Powers of the Constitution, which was where your last quiz left off, all the way up to here. So I would focus a lot on Article 2 and the first part of Article 3 as far as some of the requirements for the Supreme Court. Okay, I did give you a homework assignment. It's due Friday on the amendments. Okay, use the file that I sent to you in eBackpack to help you describe each of those amendments, and I'll explain as to what that is more so tomorrow. But you have 3 nights to work on that assignment. And then last but not least, I did send you some classwork for today. Each class is working on it as far as looking at it from a standpoint of review. Okay, and that review is to be used as a study tool for Monday. All right, your test is Monday. Keep that in mind. I'll talk a little bit more about the test on Friday. So again, thank you for hopefully paying attention. Make sure you say thank you to Mr. Khan at some point, and quiz will be tomorrow, test Monday, homework due Friday, and work on that classwork. That is something we will go over and something that you will see again in some shape or form. All right, take care, and if you guys need anything, stop by. Take care.